They thought it would be funny signing up the quiet girl with pressed flowers in her notebook to sing in front of the whole school. Phones were out, laughter was ready, and the trap was set. But when Liana stepped up to the mic in her faded floral dress, what came out of her mouth wasn't a whisper. It was a voice that stopped the world cold. They thought it would be hilarious. A joke. A middle school moment that would trend on their little corner of TikTok before disappearing by Monday. Sign up the quietest girl in 7th grade to sing a solo at the spring showcase. Watch her panic. Record it. Laugh. But what they couldn't know, was that Liana Rosewood wasn't like most kids they picked on. She had already learned how to survive the hard parts of being quiet. She just hadn't yet had the chance to show what her silence was made of. At Willow Glen Middle School in Dayton, Ohio, Liana moved through her days like a shadow. She wore secondhand jeans that bunched awkwardly at the ankles, oversized sweaters, with fading floral prints, and never looked anyone in the eye for too long. She sat in the back of the room, turned in her homework early, and always carried a sketchbook filled with pressed wildflowers carefully taped onto the pages. Most people thought she was weird. Others didn't think of her at all. That was fine. She wasn't trying to be known. Being invisible meant they left you alone, but not always. Maxie Ellison and Brielle Carter were two girls who had the kind of social power only middle school could invent. Maxie had perfect braids, the latest iPhone, and a laugh that made other kids laugh even if they didn't get the joke. Brielle was her echo, every smirk mirrored, every insult repeated. One afternoon, while waiting for their drinks in the cafeteria, Maxie saw the spring showcase sign-up sheet taped to the wall near the vending machines and nudged Brielle. "Let's give the flower freak her big moment," she said, pulling out a glitter pen from her pencil pouch. They wrote Liana Rosewood, vocal solo in big loopy cursive, and slipped it between the other real entries like it belonged there. A few kids nearby noticed. Phones came out. Someone snorted. And by last period, it was all over school. When Liana saw her name on the board the next morning, she stood still for a full 30 seconds. Her breath caught. The pink glitter ink sparkled like it was proud of what it had done. She could hear whispers behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who was watching. The usual suspects, the ones who thought pain was entertainment. But Liana didn't tear it down. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She reached into her backpack, ripped off a small corner of the sign with the performance date, and time folded it carefully and walked away. That night, she stood in the small sunroom at the back of her grandmother's house, the room Eloise had filled with ivy pots, old garden books, and hanging terrariums, and played the track on her mom's old CD player. The song was one she'd heard years ago, but never forgotten, Wildflower by Skylark. Her mother used to hum it on sleepy Sunday mornings before the illness took her away. Liana hadn't sung it out loud in a long time, only in her head when she was sketching or walking home with her earbuds and pretending her voice was something she might let out someday. Tonight, though, she didn't pretend. She waited until Eloise was asleep in her recliner, Bible open on her chest, then crept to the sunroom, closed the door, and pressed play. The music was soft, her voice softer, but it was there, and it was honest. For the next few nights, she practiced in secret, whispered verses in the bathroom with the faucet running, hummed through her pillow. She didn't have a microphone or speakers or anything fancy, just a garden stool, a cracked mirror, and her voice. But that was enough. She wasn't trying to prove anything. Not to them. Not even to herself. She just wanted to hear how the words felt out in the open. Eloise noticed the change. The faint singing late at night. The way Liana stared longer than usual at the wild roses climbing the back fence. She didn't say anything until the evening before the showcase. "You're quieter than usual," she said over a dinner of canned soup and buttered toast. Liana looked up from her bowl. "Tomorrow's the show," she said. It was the first time she'd mentioned it. Eloise blinked. "You're still going?" "Yes." Her grandmother nodded slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and disappeared into her bedroom. She returned a moment later, holding a faded floral dress, pale green with tiny yellow buds stitched near the collar. "It was your mom's," she said. "She wore it when she sang at her high school recital. I kept it just in case." Liana took the dress with both hands, fingers brushing the soft fabric. "Thank you." The next day was a blur. The showcase was scheduled for the evening, but by lunch, everyone was talking. Is she really gonna sing? No way. She's gonna freeze. Bet someone live streams it. In science class, someone passed her a note with a doodle of a wilting flower and the words, "Don't embarrass yourself." She folded it and placed it between the pages of her sketchbook without reacting. When the final bell rang, she walked straight home, changed into her mother's dress, brushed her hair flat, and slipped on her worn sneakers. Eloise drove her to the school, neither of them saying much. As they pulled into the parking lot, Eloise touched her granddaughter's hand. "You don't have to prove anything, baby. But if you do this, do it for you." Liana nodded once. Her throat was dry, her palms damp, but something in her chest burned steady and warm. The gym had been decorated with pastel streamers and folding chairs lined up in crooked rows. Parents murmured. Kids laughed too loud. Teachers milled near the bleachers trying to keep order. Backstage, Liana sat on a plastic chair marked performer number 5 and waited. Her dress felt too loose. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Through the curtains, she could hear the audience clapping for the last act, a boy juggling while riding a scooter. Then the MC stepped forward. Next up, he announced Liana Rosewood vocal solo. There was a beat of silence, then a few giggles, then quiet. Liana stepped onto the stage. The lights felt hot. Her feet felt heavy. She didn't look at the crowd, just at the taped X on the floor. In the front row, she saw Maxie raise her phone. Brielle elbowed her, already smirking. A voice near the back whispered, "Here comes the disaster." But Liana took the mic in both hands, breathed in the scent of jasmine lotion, still clinging to her fingers, and closed her eyes. The first note was delicate, barely a breath, but then it swelled. Her tone rose like smoke curling through the rafters. Soft, pure, controlled, not perfect, but real, and something about it caught people off guard. The laughter stopped, the phones lowered. One teacher tilted her head, confused. The janitor standing near the exit dropped his mop and froze. Liana kept singing. She didn't move around the stage. She didn't need to. Her stillness made the song feel like a secret she was letting the gym borrow just for 3 minutes. By the final verse, the room was utterly still. Not a cough, not a whisper. Just the sound of her voice wrapping around the lyrics like vines around a trellis. When the last note fell, she let it echo just for a breath, and then released the mic with both hands. For a second, silence. Then someone clapped. Then another. Then the room erupted. It wasn't polite. It wasn't forced. It was thunderous. Teachers stood. Parents cheered. Even a few students wiped their eyes. Eloise rose from her seat, her hand pressed to her heart, and whispered something only Liana could have understood. On the edge of the bleachers, Maxie's phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the ground. Brielle stared, mouth open. The joke had unraveled. The prank had bloomed. And Liana. She didn't smile. Not yet. She simply walked off stage, head high, heart steady, because that voice they'd all heard, it wasn't there to impress. It was there to be free. The applause was still echoing in her ears when Liana stepped off the stage, heart thudding so loudly it drowned out the rest of the show. She didn't remember walking backstage or how she made it to the folding chair with her name taped to the back. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, her voice had been louder than the laughter. And it hadn't broken her. It had carried her. That night, Eloise barely said a word on the ride home. But as they pulled into the driveway, she reached over, touched Liana's hand, and whispered, "That wasn't just a song, sweetheart. That was you blooming." The next morning at Willow Glen felt like a different school. Not in the way the hallways looked or the way the bells rang. They were the same as always, but in the way people moved when she walked by. Whispers still followed her, but they sounded different now. Curious, careful, like people were trying to make sense of what they'd seen the night before. "Did you hear her sing?" someone muttered near the lockers. "I thought it was fake, like a track." "But it was her," another replied. "No one shoved her in the hall. No one tried to trip her walking into class." Maxie and Brielle didn't say anything at all. They just looked away tight-lipped, as if they'd rather pretend the whole thing had never happened. During lunch, Liana opened her locker and found a folded piece of paper tucked inside. It wasn't a threat or a joke this time, just a simple note written in looping blue pen. "You were beautiful, like something growing in the rain. No name. Just a tiny pressed daisy taped to the corner." That afternoon, Ms. Darby, her English teacher, caught her between classes. "Liana, a moment," she said gently. Liana hesitated but followed her to the teacher's lounge, where a tall man in a green corduroy blazer and tortoiseshell glasses stood near the window, flipping through a worn leather notebook. "This is Mr. Emmanuel Thorne," Miss Darby said. "He directs a program in town called the Greenhouse Collective. It's, well, I'll let him explain." Mr. Thorne offered a warm smile. "I heard about what you did last night, and I watched the video someone's parent posted it online. You have something rare, Liana, a voice that doesn't just sound beautiful, but feels like something alive." Liana blinked, unsure what to say. He continued, "I run workshops on the weekends for young artists, singers, musicians, writers. It's not a competition, no auditions, just a space to grow. I'd love for you to join us, if you want." She nodded slowly, barely whispering, "I think I like that." That Saturday morning, Eloise drove her to an old converted greenhouse just off 3rd Street. It didn't look like a music studio at first glance, more like a place where forgotten things found new life. Ivy curled around the doorframe. Painted signs pointed to rooms labeled Solarium and Bloom Room. Inside, the scent of soil and lavender hung in the air. The floors creaked beneath her sneakers. Other kids her age stood in loose circles, some humming scales, others scribbling lyrics in notebooks, one boy beatboxing into a loop pedal. Nobody stared at her. Nobody asked why she was there. They just nodded and made space. Mr. Thorne welcomed her like she was always meant to be part of this place. They didn't jump into singing right away. They talked first about what made them create, what made them feel, what hurt. "Every song," Mr. Thorne said, "is a seed, and you are the soil it grows in." Liana didn't speak much, but when it was her turn to sing, she chose a simple melody, one she'd started humming in the sunroom days ago, but hadn't yet written down. She called it "Rooted in Rain." The words came slow at first, but then they bloomed. Petals of pain, stems of strength. By the end, the room was silent, and then someone whispered, "Dang." That was all, but it was everything. In the weeks that followed, Liana returned every Saturday. Eloise started packing her lunch with tiny notes tucked between her sandwiches. "Keep growing. You're my wildflower. Let the light in." Some days her grandma would stop by the local flower stand and work a shift just to afford a second-hand microphone she'd seen online. When it arrived, Liana held it like a secret in her hands. That spring, something shifted inside her. She no longer walked through school like a ghost. She didn't try to stand out, but she didn't shrink either. In choir class, her voice began to slip out more freely. She joined the after-school songwriting club. She even helped a 6th grader named Raina, who froze during a rehearsal, by holding her hand and whispering the lyrics with her from the front row. At home, the sunroom became her sanctuary. She wrote verses late into the night, always surrounded by her grandmother's plants. Roses, orchids, peonies, even the stubborn violets that never quite bloomed, unless the light hit just right. It was from those long hours that Rooted in Rain was born in full. A song about surviving storms, about soft strength, about growing anyway. When Mr. Thorne asked her to perform at the Collective's Community Bloom Festival in May, she said yes without hesitation. Eloise found her a dress that shimmered faintly in the sunlight, like dew on new petals. The night of the festival, the garden behind the studio was lit with string lights. Families gathered on folding chairs and picnic blankets. Children chased fireflies near the hedge. Liana stepped up to the small wooden stage just as twilight painted the sky soft lavender. She clutched her mic, took a breath, and let her song bloom. Her voice carried gently across the garden, clear, vulnerable, full of quiet power. The lyrics spoke of grief and grace, of being overlooked and still rising, of remembering the people who water your soul, even when the world tries to dry you out. By the time she finished, a hush settled over the crowd. Then applause. Not polite or obligatory, but warm, full, real. Mr. Thorne looked at her like a gardener watching something rare finally bloom. Eloise stood off to the side, her handkerchief pressed to her cheek, whispering through tears, "That's my girl." Later that evening, a younger girl approached Liana near the refreshment table. She couldn't have been more than 9. Her shoes were untied. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm scared to sing," she said. "People laugh at me." Liana crouched down, met her eyes, and said, "They laughed at me too, until they heard me. Don't give them your silence. Give them your voice." The girl smiled. Liana handed her a daisy from her notebook and walked away, not needing to see what happened next. She already knew what it felt like to be brave in bloom. The night of the Community Bloom Festival clung to Liana's memory like the fragrance of crushed petals, delicate, vivid, and impossible to shake. She had stood beneath the garden lights, microphone in hand, and sung the words she'd written from the quietest places in her heart. The applause that followed wasn't deafening, but it was deep. It felt like roots taking hold. On the ride home, Eloise didn't say much until they pulled into the driveway, the headlights cutting across their familiar porch vines. "You bloomed tonight," she said, her voice catching. "And baby, I hope you never stop." Liana didn't sleep much that night. Her body was still, but her mind was loud. Not in the way it used to be, with spirals of self-doubt and silent dread. This was different. This was the sound of possibility. And by morning, the world was already shifting again. Someone had recorded her performance at the festival, a parent with a good seat and a steady hand, and posted it with a simple caption. She wrote this herself. The video made its way through the school before first period even ended. Phones lit up with shares and messages. In the cafeteria, a group of eighth graders actually paused their jokes to ask her, "Was that really your song?" One girl added. "It felt like something I needed to hear." Liana just nodded and smiled softly, unsure how to answer. She wasn't used to being heard, and now she wasn't just heard, she was being remembered. The ripple effect reached beyond the school. That same afternoon, Ms. Darby found her during study hall and whispered, "A reporter from the local paper is trying to reach you. They want to do a segment. Something uplifting for the weekend edition." Liana blinked. "Why?" Ms. Darby smiled. "Because someone finally listened, and they think others should too." The segment aired 3 days later under the title "The Voice in the Wildflowers." It featured clips from her spring showcase performance and recent festival footage, alongside shots of her grandmother's blooming backyard and the sunroom where she wrote her songs. Mr. Thorne spoke about her rare ability to make quiet feel powerful, and Eloise, wearing her best floral scarf, simply said, "She's always had a garden inside her. Music just helped her find the light." The feature spread quickly online. By the following week, Liana's inbox was filled with messages, mentors offering coaching, local vocal groups extending invitations, and even an email from the Dayton Conservatory for Youth Arts offering her a full scholarship to their summer program. "We believe in what we've heard it read. Now we'd like to help it grow." Liana showed the email to Eloise at the kitchen table, her eyes wide. "Is this real?" she whispered. Eloise didn't answer right away. She just placed a gentle hand on Liana's and said, "So many people spend their lives trying to be seen. Yours took a single moment. Yes, baby, it's real." But for all the outside change, Liana herself didn't shift much. She still walked the same route to school, stopping to pick wildflowers from the lot behind the hardware store. She still wore her grandmother's old cardigan with the embroidered pansies along the hem. And in the hallways of Willow Glen, though students had stopped mocking her, they hadn't all turned into fans either. Some offered polite smiles. Others just stared, unsure what to make of her. A few muttered under their breath, "Guess she thinks she's something now." But Liana had grown past the need to shrink for their comfort. She didn't reply. She didn't flinch. She just kept walking. What surprised her more were the kids who began to approach her quietly. Students she'd never spoken to who walked with their heads down the way she used to. "I liked your song," one boy mumbled after choir practice. "I write poems sometimes, but they're probably dumb." "They're not," she said. "None of it is. You should keep writing." He nodded, then slipped a folded paper into her hand before walking away. It was a haiku, about moss and shadows. She read it 3 times. A few weeks later, the school counselor asked if Liana would speak at the 6th grade assembly on courage. "Not about singing," she clarified. "Just about doing something hard. Something that scared you." "Think you'd be open to that?" Liana hesitated. Public speaking felt bigger than singing. But then she thought of the quiet girl she used to be, the one who only spoke in daydreams and flower sketches, and she said yes. The day of the assembly, she stood in front of 70 younger students in the library auditorium, hands loosely clasped. No mic, no music, just her voice. "I used to think being quiet meant I was weak," she began, "that if I stayed small, I'd be safe. But then something happened, a prank actually, and I had to choose hide or speak. So I sang. And something changed. Not because everyone clapped, but because I finally heard myself. And once you hear yourself out loud, it's hard to go back to being silent." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Were you scared?" Liana smiled gently. "Terrified. But I did it anyway. That's what courage is. That quote I finally heard myself was printed and taped outside the library by the end of the week. Another teacher put it on her bulletin board. Even the janitor stopped her in the hallway one day and said, "Some flowers don't bloom till late, kid." Yours came right on time. The city took notice, too. That June, she received an invitation to perform at the Youth Harmony Gala, a prestigious annual event that gathered young artists from across Dayton. It was the kind of show with stage lights and a full auditorium. No folding chairs, no paper programs. Eloise cried when she read the invitation. "Your mama would be so proud," she whispered. "And baby, so am I." For weeks, Liana worked on a new original song, one that carried the weight of everything she'd lived and learned. She called it Thorns and Petals. It told the story of being underestimated, of walking halls lined with laughter, meant to wound, of finding voice in the silence. On the night of the performance, she stepped onto the wide wooden stage, the spotlight blooming around her like a halo. She wore a deep green dress Eloise had found at a thrift store, simple, elegant, and lined with tiny stitch vines along the sleeves. As she sang, her voice soared with clarity and calm. She wasn't trying to be loud. She wasn't trying to impress. She was just telling the truth through music, through memory, through every note that had waited years to be sung. The final line echoed through the hall, "I bloomed where they said nothing could grow." And then silence, the kind that holds its breath. Then the audience stood, not just for her voice, but for what it meant. Liana smiled softly, surely not because she had proved anyone wrong, but because she had proved herself right. That night, as she sat at the edge of her bed, the program still in her lap, Eloise walked in holding a single-pressed daffodil in a frame. "For your wall," she said, "for all the blooming still to come." Liana hung it beside her sketchbook shelf and whispered a promise to herself she'd never forget. "Some flowers grow through concrete, and I am one of them." Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones the world tries hardest to silence. Liana Rosewood's story reminds us that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. In fact, it's often in the stillness where the deepest strength is found. For so long, Liana blended into the background, mocked for her silence, overlooked because she didn't seek attention. But when life handed her a moment designed to humiliate her, she didn't shrink. She chose to rise. She chose to sing. And what the world witnessed wasn't just a beautiful voice, it was a young girl discovering her worth, her power, and her purpose. That's the lesson we carry forward today. Your voice matters even if it shakes. Maybe especially if it shakes. Whether it's through art, music, kindness, or quiet strength, we all have something inside of us that the world needs to hear or see. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need permission to take up space. And you don't need to wait for someone to believe in you before you start believing in yourself. You might be the quiet one in the room. You might be the one who's been laughed at, underestimated, or ignored. But let Liana's story be a gentle whisper in your heart. You are more than what they see. And the moment you step forward, not to prove them wrong, but to live your truth, you begin to bloom. Just like a wildflower pushing through concrete. So to anyone listening right now who feels unseen or unheard, I want you to know this: your time will come. Nurture your gift. Protect it. Let it grow in the quiet. And when your moment arrives, step into it. Because the world might not be ready, but your heart is. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. Here at Healthy Journey, we believe stories like Liana's are more than just inspiring, they're necessary. They remind us of the resilience we carry and the transformation that's always possible, no matter our age or stage of life. If this story moved you, we invite you to subscribe and join our growing community. There are more real, uplifting, and soul-nourishing stories coming your way, and we promise you won't want to miss them. From all of us at Healthy Journey, thank you for listening. And remember, even the quietest seed can become the tallest flower when it's planted with love and courage.